This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. For some of you, this might be a familiar scene. An L stop surrounded by a row of businesses. That makes it easy to grab a cup of coffee before jumping on the train or to pop into a restaurant near your stop for a bite to eat. But many L stops in the city are surrounded not by commerce and business, but by vacant lots. A new report sought to quantify the impacts of having vacant lots close to L stops and the opportunities to develop them. It's from Elevated Chicago and DePaul University's Institute for Housing Studies. So here now with more is Chicago Tribune transportation reporter Sarah Freishtat. Welcome back, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Also on the line with us is Brian Ellison, board president of Garfield Park Community Council on Chicago's West Side. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Sasha. Hello, Sarah. How are you guys? Thanks
for joining us. Sarah, I'll start with you because that report, it found that more than 1/3 of vacant lots are located close to public transit. Help quantify that for us. What are the takeaways?
Yeah, so that's actually over 14,000, almost 15,000 vacant lots are within a half a mile of transit. And I mean, look, we know the city has had a problem with vacant lots for a long time. Especially in predominantly Black communities. But quantifying them around transit is really interesting because we know that, when these lots are left unmaintained, they can be a site for environmental hazards. They can be a site for crime. And that can actually, limit. It can mean people are less willing to take a walk through their neighborhood to their local train station, right? Yeah. So I think the fear is that, these are prohibiting people from taking CTA, prohibiting visitors from using CTA to come to some of these neighborhoods for, restaurants or parks or whatever they're trying to visit. And really it affects how we get around the city.
Yeah. I hear you live just blocks from the Green Line, Brian. So talk about how often you and your family take public transit and how this issue of all the vacant lots, how that's impacting you all.
Well, both my wife and I do drive, so we rarely take public transportation downtown. I do from time to time use the Green Line as well as the Madison Street bus, which is a direct route downtown. Mm-hmm. My wife, on the other hand, because of the environment, because of the community, because of the vacant lots, doesn't necessarily feel safe to walk, to public transportation. So I would say that while I do use it from time to time, she does not.
Yeah. And you talked about some of the issues there with vacant lots. Sarah, help us connect the dots, though, about access to public transit and how these vacant lots would impact that.
Yeah, so I think, again, the studies, talking to the studies authors, they kind of outline this fear that it just might make people less willing to take public transit. Potentially,
a safety issue?
Yeah, or, a safety issue for sure, mm-hmm. A vibes issue, right? Yeah. It's a really unpleasant walk sometimes.
The experience.
Yeah. But one other issue, of course, is that if this land is vacant, obviously that means it is not being used to build housing or stores or anything anything around transit that actually you might want to use transit to get to and from, right? It's kind of a little bit of dormant potential that's just sitting there that hasn't been tapped into.
Yeah. We touched on it briefly at the beginning, but the study did look into the racial demographics of the neighborhoods with the vacant lots near public transit. Walk us through that.
Yeah. So most of the vacant lots, I think they found about 74%, were in predominantly Black communities. The communities with the most vacant lots were Inglewood and West Inglewood, East and West Garfield Park, so where Brian lives, and North Lawndale. Now, something that's really interesting about these communities is that they all have, a decent amount, at the very least, of transit presence, right? So Inglewood and West Inglewood have the Green Line, North Lawndale has the Pink Line, and actually East and West Garfield Park have two train lines, although one of them does run down the center of the highway, so a little different. Yeah. But these are typically considered neighborhood amenities, right? So easy access to other parts of the city, sites for development. So maybe
Yeah.
a lot to explore there.
Were there patterns for city-owned lots versus like the ones that are privately owned?
Yes. So the study did find most of the vacant lots near transit were privately owned, but of the ones that were owned by the city, the vast majority, 90%, were in predominantly Black communities.
Yeah.
And that's super interesting because that means that the city actually has control of these lots and can kind of shape what happens on them, right as the city has actually made some efforts to try to spur development in some of these communities.
Mm-hmm. So, Brian, as Sarah mentioned, East Garfield Park's on that list, right? So I'm curious what kinds of amenities or development you would like to see in these vacant lots.
Well, I think the Garfield Park community overall would like to see the same type of amenities that you see in a Hyde Park or in a Lincoln Park or even a Bronzeville, be it coffee shops, banks, salons, clothing stores. Those type of amenities simply no longer exist in this area, other than the commercial corridor along Madison from, say, Pulaski all the way west.
Mm-hmm.
With regard to recent development, this community did, over the past several years, receive the completion of a facility called the Hatchery, which has kind of spurred some interest in Garfield Park. It's a incubator space for people interested in getting into the culinary arts and catering services.
Okay.
There also is currently an affordable housing development that's going up right now. It's a mixed-use development that has both affordable housing as well as commercial, which is called Fit City Commons. And that project broke ground in June, and we're really looking forward to it being able to spur additional affordable housing development in this area.
So if, in addition to that development that you just mentioned, Brian, and if there were stores instead of vacant lots and people out and about in your area, do you think that would change your mind and your wife's mind when it comes to taking the train?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that just the lack of being comfortable walking through a community that has vibrancy and color and activity and people and businesses, it definitely helps.
Sarah, you also looked into the area around the 95th Red Line stop. Talk us through that. What did residents tell you?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting area to focus on right now. There's been kind of a little bit more emphasis on it recently as we're talking about this big, huge project to extend the Red Line south from 95th. A big part of the conversation around that project has been the potential for that train line to spur development in the neighborhood. So I spoke with Charles Perry, who just bought a building right near the 95th Red Line station. He hopes to open an ice cream shop there. But basically, he said that area should be clean and well kept, like transit hubs are in other parts of the city. That is a huge transit hub.
Yeah.
But he worried about the vacant lots in the area. He said they can be used for illegal dumping, and he called them demeaning for the community.
Yeah, I saw that in your story, and it was striking. He said also, after saying it was demeaning, he said, it says we don't value the space that we have.
Yeah, in my conversation with him, I guess he knows that community. He spoke so highly of the people who live there, but basically said, it just seemed really different from really transit-rich areas elsewhere in the city.
How is the city approaching development around train stations in general, and compared to what the policy looked like in the past?
Yeah, so the city actually has kind of had this renewed focus on development near transit. A couple years ago, Alderman approved an update to an ordinance intended to spur development because the city itself found that previous versions of this policy, previous versions of these efforts, had really mostly led to development in areas that are already high cost. So like the north side, the near northwest side, the West Loop, downtown. kind of the areas you might expect.
Right.
So they proposed this update that is intended both to make some of those really high cost areas more affordable, and try to undo some of those inequities.
Brian, talk more about your ideas for developing these lots, but also keeping the affordability going and avoiding just gentrifying the place.
Well, that's something that this community is very, very focused on. And there's several initiatives in place to help ensure that gentrification doesn't happen in Garfield Park, as well as both Aldermen, Irvin and Burnett, whose wards these communities share, are very well aware of not only the need of developing affordable housing in this community, but being able to retain what we see as legacy residents that have lived in this community for years, not being put in a situation where they can't afford to live over here anymore as a result of the development that's going on. Some of these efforts have to do with groups coalescing together to come together to develop these sites, these city and county owned sites. And from what I've seen, the efforts are going in a good direction.
What about different options for development, Sarah? How does something like, putting in housing versus business into these vacant lots, how does that in turn affect public transit?
I think the study did outline maybe some of the ideas from community members that the study authors, that they heard from community members.
Did they have a preference?
Well, I think I according to them, affordable housing or maintaining the affordability of housing, certainly grocery stores. Yeah. But definitely I defer to Brian on this. He would be the expert.
Yeah, no, I'm curious what you think, Brian. Putting in housing versus putting business into these vacant lots.
This community needs both. This community needs both. And as it stands right now, there's an effort for a grocery store development to happen west on Madison, as well as, residential units being developed throughout, these scattered lots that exist in the community. This community desperately needs both more affordable housing as well as commercial development.
And we've talked so much about the city, Brian. Any thoughts about incentivizing private property owners?
I can't really speak to that. I think that, one of the challenges with development in general is the fact that the costs are what they are, whether you're building an affordable house or a market rate house. And I think what developers look to are money, from the city, from the state, to be able to help subsidize these developments, to be able to keep them not only at a price point that's affordable to residents, but at a profit margin that allows the developers to stay in business at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, as we await some of these upcoming developments, Sarah, anything that you're going to be keeping an eye on?
Yeah. Definitely this city ordinance, the city policy, and kind of how it plays out.
Yeah.
I did ask about that. I did ask the study's authors what they thought about that. They did say it's a little bit too soon, right? Development takes time.
Right.
But I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye on really whether it works.
We've been talking with Sarah Freishtat, Chicago Tribune transportation reporter, and Brian Ellison, who's a board leader of Garfield Park Community Council on Chicago's West Side. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.